Desperate times call for desperate measures. Just ask Pakistan. It's dialing everyone on the phone book, old allies, new friends, anybody who can help them out of this crisis. Let's begin with the old ally, the United States of America. Pakistan's ambassador to Washington made an appeal recently. He asked the US to restore military aid and sales to Pakistan. It was stopped by Donald Trump in 2018. Trump accused Pakistan of playing a double game on terrorism. Now, it was an open secret here in India, but I guess it took the Americans decades to realize. Either way, Trump ended military assistance in 2018. But now Pakistan wants it back. The question is, will Joe Biden agree to this? He did approve a military upgrade for Pakistan's F-16 fleet last year. It was a package worth $450 million. But the aid package frozen by Trump is much bigger, almost $1.3 billion. That's what Islamabad is eyeing, $1.3 billion. Their second SOS call was to their so-called iron brother China. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif spoke to China's new premier. Two major issues were discussed. One was the economy. China promised support to maintain financial stability in Pakistan. God knows they need it. And second, Chinese assets in Pakistan. Shehbaz Sharif promised to ensure the safety of Chinese workers, institutions and projects. Recently, they've been targeted by terror attacks. Pakistan's army chief is also on the job. General Asim Munir is on a trip to China. It's the first by a Pakistani army chief since the pandemic. He met senior diplomat Wang Yi. The two men reaffirmed the so-called all-weather ties between China and Pakistan. So that's two outreach campaigns by Islamabad, one to America, another to China. They're trying to balance both the big powers, and they're not alone. Countries across the world have been balancing America and China. So why is Pakistan different? Because they are beholden to both. Let me explain. China makes up 30% of Pakistan's total debt. Chinese money is keeping the country running. So good relations with China is not a goal, it's a necessity. Same with America. Most Pakistani weapons are of US origin. They need American help to repair and expand their arsenal. And don't forget the IMF help. Without American support, Pakistan can forget that bailout. So Pakistan needs the Americans as well. The question is, will Joe Biden fall for it? In the last century, his predecessors did. Two events made the Americans embrace and cultivate Pakistan. The first was their covert operations in Afghanistan. They used Pakistan as a launching pad. Weapons, money, everything went from Pakistan to Afghanistan. And the second was the US-China normalization. Pakistan was a key broker in those talks. With their help, America opened relations with communist China in the 70s. But that was decades ago. Now the dynamics have changed. For starters, Pakistan is virtually powerless in Afghanistan. In fact, the Taliban have started dictating terms to Islamabad. And secondly, the US has a growing partnership with India. They need India as a bulwark against China. So it's a question of pure strategic importance. Who brings what to the table? Right now, Pakistan brings a whole lot of instability and nuclear weapons, and that's what many experts point to. Pakistan is home to the most dangerous nuclear stockpile. If they fall into the wrong hands, anything could happen. So what does the US do? Keep the relationship alive without investing in it. But going forward, that could become hard. Why? Because Pakistan is growing ever closer to China. Maybe it's out of compulsion, but Washington may not see it that way. Just consider what happened last month. Joe Biden hosted his summit for democracy. More than 100 countries participated. Guess who did not? Pakistan. And they got an invite, but they decided not to attend. I hope America is seeing these moves. A Chinese colony cannot possibly be an ally against Beijing. It's like trying to recruit Canada in the war against US. Simply won't work. America must realize that South Asia's strategic stability is not pinned on Pakistan. In fact, Pakistan is the biggest threat to it. Remember Voldemort from Harry Potter? At first, nobody called him by his name. They were scared and unsure. They called him you-know-who, or he who must not be named. But towards the end of the books, that changed. They started saying Voldemort's name. People realized you can't hide from your fear. You must confront it. Perhaps Western countries should read that chapter because they can't decide what to call China. Competitor? Rival? Enemy? It depends on who you ask at what time, and this ambiguity applies to their policy as well. They can't decide what to do with China, decouple, diversify, or as the US is now saying, de-risk. Listen in to the White House National Security Advisor.
We are for de-risking and diversifying, not decoupling. We'll keep investing in our own capacities and in secure, resilient supply chains. We'll keep pushing for a level playing field for our workers and companies and defending against abuses.
To be clear, it's not a new term. The European Union has previously talked about de-risking. So have businesses in the West. But the question is, what does it mean? How do you de-risk from China? This was Jake Sullivan's explanation.
Our export controls will remain narrowly focused on technology that could tilt the military balance. We're simply ensuring that U.S. and allied technology is not used against us. We are not cutting off trade.
In case you missed that, the US will not cut off trade with China. Instead, it will focus on strategic technology, things that could have military functions or things that could be used against Western allies. I can give you an example from last year. The US decided to suspend deliveries of F-35 jets. Why? Because the aircraft had Chinese parts inside. Another example could be Huawei. The company has been banned in multiple Western nations. The fear is they snoop for Beijing. These are all examples of de-risking. But why has Washington decided on this policy? And more importantly, what happened to decoupling? The simple answer is money. China-US trade is worth more than $600 billion. This includes a diverse basket of goods like garments made in Xinjiang and precious metals from Tibet. Some of these goods have been sanctioned by the US, but not all of them. And from the looks of it, Washington wants to keep it that way. They don't want to decouple from China. They want to pick and choose what to buy and sell. I'm not saying this is the wrong policy. I'm saying it's a confused policy. On one hand, you are engaged in a new Cold War with the Chinese. On the other hand, you're trying to preserve economic ties with them. Can enemies really trade with each other? That question brings us to the point of clarity, or rather the lack of it. Earlier this month, French President Emmanuel Macron visited China. He said Europe simply cannot be America's vassal. He wanted to chart a different relationship with Beijing. Same with Germany. Chancellor Olaf Scholz is vigorously pushing for a port deal with China. The deal is for one terminal of the Hamburg port. China wants to buy a 25% stake in it. Scholz's own allies are opposed to the deal, but the chancellor is eager to clear it. At the same time, Germany is looking to curb the export of chip chemicals to China. Do you see the problem here? You're letting China invest in your port, but you're not selling chip chemicals to them. Is this not picking and choosing? Is this not confusion? The fact is, there is a clear political conflict between the West and China. And there is no denying that. But the West wants to insulate their economy from the conflict. Hence, de-risk and not decouple. The problem is, China knows this. They have inserted themselves into key global supply chains, which means two can play at this game. If the West can partially squeeze China, China can return the favor. So what's the way out? Well, Jake Sullivan mentioned that too. Diversification, he said, taking supply chains out of China and somewhere safe. But to do that, you need to have clarity. All this de-risk talk is nothing but confusion. It's only giving China more time to prepare for any financial assault. Meanwhile, the Russians are striking beyond Ukrainian territory. They're targeting Americans too, not with missiles, but with prank calls. And this is no laughing matter. World leaders are falling for it. Former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, singer Elton John, Polish President Andrzej Duda, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, even Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, they've all fallen prey to Russian pranksters. In the best case scenario, it's embarrassing. In the worst case scenario, it's dangerous. The latest victim is this man, Jerome Powell, the chairman of the US Federal Reserve. He heads the Central Bank of America. He got a prank call from Russia. The caller pretended to be Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and he managed to get Powell on the phone. It did not happen today or this week. This call, we are told, was made in January. We are talking about it today because now we have more details and statements. Apparently, it was a video call. Powell picked up the phone and had a full-blown discussion on a range of topics, from the inflation outlook to the Russian central bank. They talked about all of it. And now the video is doing the rounds. Reports say it has been released by the Russian state media. We've not been able to access the video yet, but we do have some quotes. Here is what Powell is believed to have said on the subject of inflation, and I'm quoting. "We would tell you that a recession is almost as likely as very slow growth. I think that is partly because of us having raised rates quite a bit, but this is what it takes to get inflation down." That's what Powell told the fake Zelensky. And let me remind you, this isn't some low-level official sitting in a government office. This is the chairman of the US Fed, a man you cannot access easily, but a bunch of Russians got him on a video call and got him to talk about the economy and inflation. Do you know who these people were? Two Russian comedians, Vladimir Krasnov and Alexei Stolyarov, better known as Vovan and Lexus. They call themselves supporters of Putin, and they say they're the ones who pulled off this stunt. Meanwhile, the US Fed has admitted to the blunder. This is what their statement says, and I'm quoting, "It was a friendly conversation and took place in a context of our standing in support of the Ukrainian people in this challenging time. No sensitive or confidential information was discussed. The matter has been referred to appropriate law enforcement, and out of respect for their efforts, we won't be commenting further." So the Fed says no damage done. And yet this is worrying because it's not a first. In the past, Vovan and Lexus have fooled other politicians, the likes of Boris Johnson, not when he was the Prime Minister, but when he was the UK's Foreign Secretary. The Russian comedians made a hoax call to him, and London blamed the Kremlin for this. Then earlier this year, Christine Lagarde fell prey to something similar. She is the chief of the European Central Bank. The pranksters used the same trick on her. They impersonated Zelensky and spoke to Lagarde. I've already told you about the other leaders who fell for this trick. And even though no sensitive information was shared, not that we know of, the very fact that they keep getting pranked should disturb them. These are men and women who run our world. They lead major countries and economies. They flex their militaries at the mere hint of a provocation. They slap sanctions to make rivals bend, but they keep falling for Russian pranks. And you have to feel for Zelensky. How many videos has he made since the war began? Even did a photo shoot for the Vogue, yet his friends in the West cannot tell the fake from the real. All we can say is this: before they plan their next big move, perhaps they should hire a fact checker. Our next story is from Japan. For all its great advancements, Japan has one very regressive feature. It ranks poorly on gender equality, far behind other G7 members, the world's top 7 economies. And now Japan is trying to fix this. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida made an announcement yesterday. Let me quote from what he said. "We seek to have the ratio of women among executives at 30% or more by 2030 in companies that are listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange's prime market." What does this mean? Will it help fix Japan's problem? Should other countries look at aggressive policy initiatives to achieve gender parity? Also, where does India feature in the global rankings? Our next report has the answers.
Japan has a problem: gender inequality. It's rampant in the island nation, and it's quite at odds with Japan's reputation as a developed country. Across the developed world, Japan ranks dead last when it comes to gender equality. Japan ranks 104 out of 190 countries in the World Bank's 2023 Women, Business and the Law report. In the World Economic Forum's 2022 Global Gender Gap Report, it ranked 116th out of 146 countries. Survey after survey, year after year, have all said the same thing, that Japan's women have it rough. Now, the Japanese government says it's trying to fix things. Yesterday, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida made an announcement. He wants more executive positions at the country's top companies to be occupied by women. Women should make up 30% of the executives at companies that are listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange's prime market. The deadline is 2030. How close is Japan to that target? Not close at all. As of July last year, women accounted for only 11.4% of senior corporate and auditing positions at the companies. Japan Inc. would need to nearly triple their women executives. That too in just 7 years. The only silver lining is that the present 11.4% was also reached after a government diktat. Japan had set a 12% women executives target for 2022, so reaching 11.4% isn't too shabby. But Japan is still far behind comparable global standards. Comparable is the operative word. Recently, the EU Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights said Japan's gender gap resembled the situation in Europe 20 or 30 years ago. So Tokyo is still far behind its contemporaries in the developed world. And it's not just business. Let's look at politics. Women occupy only about 10% of the seats in Japan's lower house of parliament. Just 28% of Japan's upper house seats are held by women. And this is after a recent increase in women's representation. To get a clear idea about gender disparity in Japanese politics, you need look no further than Kishida's government. He's clearly not practicing what he's preaching. Only 2 out of 19 cabinet posts are occupied by women. The most ironic part, Japan's Minister of State for Gender Equality is a man. So if Kishida is serious about fixing Japan's gender imbalance, he could start with his own cabinet. But this problem of gender inequality is rampant across Asia in general. The worst offending region happens to be South Asia. India, for example, ranked 126 out of 190 countries in the World Bank's 2023 Women, Business and the Law report. And it's one of the better places for women in South Asia. Among its neighbors, India ranks behind only Nepal. The World Economic Forum ranks India at 135th place out of 146 countries. South Asia once again does poorly overall. The WEC says it'll take the region about 200 years to achieve gender parity. And it certainly doesn't help matters to have Afghanistan as a member. Imagine trying to correct the gender imbalance with the Taliban in your team. Jokes aside, patriarchy is not just pervasive, but a tough cookie to crack. So Japan-style mandates may be needed to break the resistance. But even that doesn't always work. The Indian state of Nagaland, for example, has been resisting a government quota on women's representation in politics. Many locals say it goes against tradition. It's an age-old argument, one that's been used in Japan as well. But Japan has finally started to realize that change is needed. Hopefully, South Asia gets there soon too. Because women deserve a seat at the table. And we're not talking about just the ones in your kitchen.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with the Pope. Pope Francis is in Hungary for a 3-day visit. This is his first trip since he was admitted to hospital in March. Spain, meanwhile, has put an end to the tradition of dwarf bullfighting, a move that has been lauded by disability groups. In Kenya, citizens are planting their age in trees, an active effort to combat deforestation in the country. And finally, what makes April the 28th significant? We're taking you back in history. On this day in 1945, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was executed. He was shot dead by Italian partisans. This happened while he and his mistress were trying to flee to Switzerland. Mussolini was then hung upside down in Milan's public square. A gruesome death for the dictator who once founded fascism. We leave you on that note. Thanks for watching.
Grazie che lei
email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.